Hey, it's Max. You hate it? I hate it. We all hate it. That's right, it's the C1 class. As Melbourne's first, debatably functional low-floor tram, they've been terrorising the network for most of this century. As it's such a cheap and badly designed vehicle, I naturally wanted to replicate it in LEGO way back when I was starting to design my first proper LEGO trams. I clearly didn't have the skill to do so at the time since it's been 3 years, but I've come a long way since then. And it's 3 years ago that we start from, with my first few drafts of what was a tram that would never see the light of day. This was coming off the back of my almost complete failures that are my D classes, which I've only just finalised a few months ago. Anyway, in a similar vein to my D classes, my first C1 class was doomed from the start. I thought it would be a great idea to use a whole lot of snot, studs not on top, panels to make up the walls, which it clearly wasn't, since I barely got past the first stages of construction because of them. The main idea behind using snot panels was that I could get the thin lines between the windows and doors, without using stickers and the like. At that time, I hadn't the faintest idea of how I was going to stick in my B class, let alone something that I had barely started. Another reason I wanted to make use of snot panels was because I thought it would be easier to angle the walls, to more closely replicate the real trams. I have since learnt that thin lines are not always worth the headache that they give, and through my Z and G classes, I've learnt that I'm not ready to make use of significant sections of subtly angled walls on my more compact trams, especially those with interiors. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. I clearly wasn't getting anywhere fast, especially since these iterations represent a few months of tinkering, so I abandoned the project. As it goes, time passed, and then, at Brickvention 2024, there was a glorious diorama of the Montague Street Bridge, complete with the first LEGO C1 class I had seen. This got me thinking on and off for a while, and 6 months later I sat down and reopened the long-lost C1 file, only to immediately conclude that I'd have to start from scratch. And that I did, but this time with almost 3 more years of experience under my belt, which I put to varying levels of use. As usual, the first thing I worked on was the window spacing, which ended up being just about what you'd expect, a whole lot of 1x4x3 panels, interspersed with 1x1x3 bricks. I made the end window and door 3 studs wide, as opposed to the 2 studs I went with on my first version, and planned to fill it in with a snot build for the door, and either that or a mix of transparent bricks for the fake door side. This wasn't particularly ideal, because odd-width snot builds can create some interesting geometry, but I figured that it wouldn't be that big of an issue because of the extra stud of space I had to work with thanks to the generous spacing I'd given myself between the window and door sections. That extra stud was of course something I tried to avoid on my previous design. However, after some surface level experimenting, I conceded that I might never finish the tram if I didn't make that change. I am also much more experienced with making stickers now, which helped with that decision, although I would still call myself somewhat of an amateur when it comes to that stuff. Satisfied with the window spacing, I moved on to create a general outline of the body on the central section. Once again, I conceded that at my current skill level, I could be here for another 3 years trying to make the subtle angle on the wall fit together, so I made a bog standard box. I tried to build out snot windows again, but to get the height of the wall that I wanted, I had to build studs up and extend the height of the windows slightly. I did this by placing black plates at the tops of the windows to emulate the real tram, with the intention of using black stickers to bulk out the sides. Now that I was mostly happy with the general proportions, I copied them through to the end sections. But before I pushed all the way to the cab, I put together the bogies, making use of my 5-stud gauge 100% low floor design. I originally created them for one of my disastrous D-class revamps, which have an even stud carriage length. However, because of the extra stud I'd placed in between the windows, the C1 was an odd length. This complicated things a fair bit, but I eventually found a workaround. This may have been a good opportunity for me to make the bogies 50mm more accurate though, since the C1 class's bogies wheelbase is ever so slightly longer than the standard 1800mm bogie wheelbase seen on all but one other modern Melbourne tram. The 1800mm wheelbase is what I modelled all of my 5-stud gauge bogies after, and redesigning the bogie wheelbase to be only the slightest bit longer, the equivalent of less than one of said LEGO bogies on the real thing, seemed a bit over the top, like this explanation, so I scrapped the idea well before attempting it. By the way, a part of the aforementioned workaround to offset the bogie on the odd length body was making everything around it into a decently strong and rigid module that could support the tram's weight without crumbling into pieces. I didn't quite get it right the first time round, or the second for that matter, so the bogie module went through many revisions, right up until the very day I ordered the parts. It ended up being a bit of a plate soup, but it somehow clutches up. I also started to attempt an interior, which was a side effect of the bogie module. The first seat design used a similar technique to parts of my D classes, and was one that I'd later reuse for my G class interior to great effect. The design proved to be aesthetically inferior to another design I came up with a short time after because it was out of scale and, more importantly, could only be one colour. You see, the maquettes on all Melbourne tram seats are a bright green, whether that be Yarra trams or PTV, but the back of C1 class seats are blue, with the exception of 3025 because there just has to be one, and I decided to replicate these as the dominant colours. The seats ended up being a sub-build made up of 4 pieces. I decided not to merge the ones side by side because it looked more accurate, which could be considered excessive, but I loved the result. Not every seat is green though, some also have the orange priority maquette, which I did replicate and even bought the pieces for, but since I chose not to incorporate any orange seats into my previous trams, I decided to leave it out. The middle carriage also has a bum rack along the left side facing the number 1 end, which I tried to replicate closely, but there weren't any good curved slopes small enough, so I stuck with regular 2/3 height slopes. With the bogie and interior situation mostly sorted, I inched closer to the cab, installing the front door and corresponding window. I used brackets to gain an extra half plate as gap filler, and for the top and bottom I used 1x3s, the ends of which I planned to cover with stickers, and the general design of which served as an inspiration for my G-Classes doors. By this point I'd run out of tram to move forward with, and had to start work on the cab. As it so often is, it was challenging to get the proportions and shape looking right. My first designs were very blocky, and getting the curve at the bottom to look clean was a major hassle. After going through what felt like every single curved slope LEGO has ever produced, I landed on a combination of macaroni tiles with supporting wedge plates for the sides, and inverted curved slopes for the base that I could attach further back into the main frame of the tram. These pieces also served as the foundation for the windscreen, which I angled using simple hinge bricks. Creating the quadrilateral side windows was harder than it would first appear. I originally tried to build it studs up, which I quickly abandoned because it would be too blocky along the angled edge, so I switched it up for a snot design, which closely mirrored the false door window. The angled edge at the front was still difficult, and I revised the placement of the plates, studs and slopes multiple times. To get the black trim at the top of it, I couldn't use conventional methods since it tapered to approximately 2.5 studs. If you watched my Hitachi video, you would know that LEGO fortunately made 2.5 stud long pieces back in the day in the form of 3 different hinge plates and tiles. I went with the 3-finger version of the hinge plate, and I think it really ties it all together. The section that the hinge comes from isn't actually connected to the window. Instead, it comes out from the wall using a 2x2/1x4 hinge plate. Before I finalised the front part of the cab, I tried to use a 1x2 curved slope, but that clearly wasn't going to work. To find what profile it had to mirror, I needed to make the curve on the top of the cab, so I came up with a 3x5 design using 1x3 and 2x3 curved slopes. From this, I could attempt to round off the sides. My first and only proper solution used a cheese slope and a 1x2x2/3 curved slope wedge. Despite the crudeness of the design, I never came up with anything better. The front desto was a slight challenge since it's curved at the sides, but the quarter tires really saved me on that one, and the way I got it to flow seamlessly with the windscreen really makes me happy with it. The only thing I don't love about the desto is it ended up slightly too small, but I could only do so much. So far, the cab had been decently kind to me, bar the bottom curve, but the hardest part by far were the 2 struts coming down either side of the front windscreen. I thought about doing it with bars, but I couldn't come up with a way to connect them to the rest of the cab. Not that much else was attached to the time, mind you. I then tried much thicker tiles, and struggled to connect them as well. I attempted to connect them from just about every place I could think of, and eventually came across a design that used the desto at the top as its connection point. I never really loved the design as its thickness detracted from the sleekness of the cab, and the tiles were only connected by a single stud, meaning that it would be extremely weak. Suffice to say, it needed to be fixed, but I left the cab in that sorry state while I went to go work on the roof. The roof was tougher than you'd think, in part due to a lack of usable references. I could have always gone out somewhere high up and got my own, but I never got that far, so I had to make do with what I could find. What you're seeing here was recorded well after I built the C1. I had planned on going back and redesigning the roof at some stage, but it's honestly fine as it is. I started the roof with the end sections, and came up with a fairly rudimentary design for it, but despite its low poly nature, it captures the gist of it decently. The central section was a bit harder to do, so I started with the simple stuff. The way I would usually create the fans on the big box in the middle is with round tiles, but because they were on the edges of it, it would detract from the overall shape. I would have loved to use 2x2 turntable bases, but they don't come in any dark grey. so the solution I came up with was to use the other type of 2x2 turntable base, and I only landed on this piece after looking through almost the entirety of LEGO's catalogue. It was around this point that I lost motivation to continue with the design, so I chucked a panto on it, made some renders, and went off to design some other things. The burnout was partly triggered by the trim along the roofline. It's made predominantly out of 1x4x1 1/3 curved slopes, with 1x2 and 2x1x1 1/3 curved slopes at the ends. The central carriage is an odd length and needed a 1x slope in the middle, but I couldn't use the 2x1 version because it sticks in by a plate. I originally tried to shoehorn one in by covering it up with some roof elements, but it just did not fit. A few months later I came back to finish the C1, and to sidestep the issue I created a custom part that was a 1x2 curved slope sliced in two, which worked just fine. And then 12 days after I built the tram, LEGO released the exact part I needed in white. You can't make that stuff up. The pantograph was the next thing to get done. The pantograph I used is actually my D-classes, which is technically inaccurate, but it's close enough. Its base is a hodgepodge of bricks, but it all fits together in the end. As usual, I wanted the roof to be removable, and that came down to its structure. The end section's roof had a base made out of staggered 2x12 plates, and the central section's is made out of a 6x8 and a 10x8 plate, and I later added a 2x16 for stability. The way I attached it to the rest of the tram was similar to my B-class's roof, with corner plates protruding from the walls. When the roof is in place, it's as sturdy as anything, but when attempting to remove it, it poses some issues because I couldn't attach the anti-stud attachment securely, at least on the end sections. Despite my best efforts trying to move everything I could around, it just would not work. The roof sags ever so slightly in the middle, but, like the end roofs, there wasn't much I could do about it. I could potentially replace the 1x1 plates underneath the shorter 1x1 curved slopes with 1x2 plates. I prototyped it after I'd built the tram, and unfortunately the 1x2s liked to stick to the roof and not the wall, which rendered it impractical. The roof was now done, and in many regards, so was the tram. But I wasn't. The cab was still hurting me badly, so I set about reworking it. I knew that I needed to put those bars in for the side struts, I just needed to figure out how. The 1x6 plate protruding from behind the desto needed to go, so I swapped it out for two 1x2 clip plates, which were perfect for taking bars. There's a serious gap which is something I wanted to avoid when I first tried to use bars, but in hindsight it's really not as bad as I thought it was. There were a few more things I wanted to tie up with the cab. Firstly, I slimmed the snot curves on either side to be more in line with the bars by removing the wedge plate behind them. This weakened the 2x2 macaroni's connection, but it still works out. Narrowing the cab threw the roof out of whack. The previous design was of course 5 studs wide, but now I needed to whittle it down to 4. I chose not to go with the obvious solution of just 2x3 curved slopes, because it left a larger gap on the sides that I thought looked crude. A few designs later, and I came up with a system using an angled 2x4 curved slope and 2 of the relatively new 1x2x2/3 slopes tacked on the side. Ignoring the slight variance created by the 1x2 slopes, it follows the profile of the real tram's roof closer than the old design did. The very last thing I had to sort out was connecting almost every element of the cab to the rest of the tram. As mentioned previously, the windscreen is connected via the inverted curves to the rest of the tram body. While it might look like the desto is attached to the windscreen, it actually avoids it completely. It's a crazily messy connection, snaking its way back into the tram with 2 hinge bricks, like the windscreen, then followed by 2 inverted brackets. The brackets are indirectly connected to the bar and clip plates angling the top curve. The panels at the bottom are connected using standard 2x2/1x4 hinge plates, like the very top section, except that they're not standard. I creatively split them into their constituent parts and swapped the colours to create a clean edge to the grey trim along the bottom. The last connection hurdle that I had to overcome were the side windows. They proved challenging but met their match with a simple inverted bracket and a 1x2 plate. This solution allowed me to build the entire section with only transparent pieces. The bracket pops up a bit, but with the reinforcing slope you could pass it off as part of the cab console. There is a slight stress on the bars from the windows at the top, but it's nothing game-breaking. It is fixable, but that would affect the straightness of the inferred line. Now that the designing was done, I had to build it. I probably should have sped up the seat building a lot more in the time-lapse because wow, that took a long time. The building went smoothly, but I wasn't done improving the tram. Since building it, I've made 3 changes. In the speed build, I tried to use trans clear pieces for the windscreen to match all of my rolling stock, but I liked the consistency of the trans brown wraparound. While filming the scenes at Barker's Road, I realised that I missed the vents on the cab roof, and it seemed so obvious as to how to do it, replacing the 1x4 tile with grille tiles. I should also replace the bricks below it to be black, but it works as a patch-up. The final change I made was to the gap between the sections. Originally, it had a 2.5 stud gap, which is the standard gap I put between carriages with toe balls. For the showcase video, I wanted to create concertinas for the articulation, and inspired by my fake Extrapolis 2.0 articulations, I cobbled together some 2-stud wide ones. To facilitate these, I reworked the toe ball connections to accommodate shorter variants. I don't think I'll use this method much moving forward because articulations come in all different shapes and sizes, most of which are not this easy to replicate using simple grill tiles. It also, of course, cannot take corners with them installed, so it's purely a display feature. In the intro, I said that I hate C1s, but truth be told, I don't mind the Tram. Yes, they have shocking ride quality and derail even without the thought of it, but they have a charm to them, as do all trams. The aesthetics of the C1s is probably their best feature, even if to some they look bland. To me, they look the most default tram out of all of them, and that must count for something. It seems that PTV agrees with me, because I'm fairly certain, for all intents and purposes, that this is meant to be a C1. It's unfortunate that Yarra trams have moved on to E-classes, and don't even seem to know how C1s work for that matter. I mean, what is this bogie doing here? Was it stolen from a D2? Part of the C1's tendency to become buses can be attributed to the horrendous combination of fixed bogies, an insane overhang, and I think also the way the sections are connected. My mock gives me a great opportunity to explain what I mean, but I'm by no means an expert, so I'll do my best. The configuration with 3 sections and the fixed bogies already creates an issue with violent cornering when entering and exiting curves and severe hunting oscillation. And adding in the overhang works to amplify the effect by acting like a massive counterweight, but that's not all. This bit is much more speculative on my part, but the C1 class's articulations can only rotate side to side, whereas, for example, one of the D1 class's articulations can also twist. I suspect that the lack of this movement contributes to their wobbliness, especially on uneven track, as you're effectively pushing all of the weight onto only one side of each bogie, creating a torsion force, as illustrated here. The suspension then has to compensate greatly, resulting in the Alstom-worthy ride. Why doesn't this happen to A-classes, for instance? Well, it all harks back to the fixed bogies and counterweight-like overhang. It's subtle, but you can definitely see the C1's front and rear carriages hunting like beasts, which doesn't happen to the A-classes because the track is only affecting the bogies and not an entire carriage. By far the most accurate and fun part of my mock is that it wobbles exactly like the real thing. This is legitimately only the wind here, nothing else. And I think that's all I have to talk about. If you enjoyed, why not subscribe? And if you want to go the extra mile and support my work, why not chuck a membership in? Huge thanks to Jay, Stefan, and Victorian Transport History for your support. Thanks for watching, see you next time.